People reveal who they truly are by how they treat someone they believe cannot answer back, Nathaniel Crawford once said during an interview with Forbes magazine. But on the cold December night that changed everything inside the Windsor Palace Hotel, he completely failed his own test. Snow drifted slowly across Manhattan beneath silver streetlights, while luxury cars lined the glowing entrance of the hotel like polished black mirrors beneath the storm. Inside the grand ballroom, warm golden chandeliers reflected against marble floors and crystal wine glasses, while a jazz pianist played softly near the towering windows overlooking Central Park. The room smelled of expensive perfume, French wine, and old money. Investors from Paris moved through the crowd beside politicians, executives, and international business advisors dressed in tuxedos worth more than some people's yearly salary. And moving quietly through all of it was Sophie Laurent, 29 years old, blonde hair tied neatly behind her neck, pale skin softened by the warm ballroom lights. A black waitress uniform pressed perfectly despite the exhaustion hidden behind her calm blue eyes. She carried a silver tray filled with Bordeaux glasses through rivers of conversation, while wealthy guests barely noticed her existence. Sophie preferred it that way. Invisible people heard everything. Near the center of the ballroom stood Nathaniel Crawford, founder and CEO of Crawford International Holdings, one of the largest private investment firms in New York. Tall, controlled, sharp jawline, dark tuxedo tailored perfectly against broad shoulders. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Investors called him ruthless. Tonight, he was hosting a private French investment gala involving a billion-dollar luxury infrastructure partnership with European financiers, and every detail inside the ballroom had been carefully designed to impress. Nathaniel glanced impatiently toward a serving table where one of the wine selections had not yet been presented correctly beside the French delegation. "Where is the Chateau Margaux?" he asked sharply. Sophie immediately stepped forward, carrying the bottle carefully against her arm. "Right here, sir." Nathaniel reached for the bottle, while several investors watched nearby. "You pronounce it softly," he corrected coldly after hearing her accent. "Not like an American tourist." A few people near the table laughed quietly beneath their breath. Sophie lowered her eyes politely. "I apologize." Nathaniel barely looked at her again as he adjusted the bottle label toward the guests. Details matter in rooms like this. Sophie simply nodded once before stepping back silently with the tray balanced carefully in her hands. To everyone watching, she looked exactly like what they assumed she was. A waitress embarrassed by a wealthy man in front of important people. Nothing more. But 10 minutes later, everything changed. The French investors gathered near the ballroom windows beside a massive display of luxury property projections while Nathaniel reviewed financial models with his executive team. One older investor from Paris, silver-haired and elegant beneath the chandelier lights, suddenly frowned while reading part of the translated presentation packet. He switched to rapid French without warning. Not modern conversational French. Older Parisian business French layered with formal diplomatic phrasing difficult even for fluent speakers to follow comfortably. The assigned interpreter beside the stage froze almost immediately. "I apologize," the interpreter stammered nervously. "Could you repeat that more slowly?" The French investor looked visibly irritated. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances while tension quietly spread through the ballroom. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The investor repeated the question again, this time even faster. The interpreter looked completely lost now. Silence settled awkwardly across the room. Then from beside the wine station, a calm female voice spoke softly in flawless French. "Monsieur is asking why the projected tax structure ignores regional preservation exemptions attached to historical Parisian commercial districts after the 2018 revisions." The ballroom froze. Every head turned immediately towards Sophie Laurent, standing quietly beside the silver wine cart. Her pronunciation sounded effortless, elegant, precise in a way impossible to fake. The older French investor blinked in visible surprise before responding rapidly in even more formal French. Sophie answered again without hesitation. Perfectly, calmly, naturally. Nathaniel stared at her from across the ballroom as though seeing her for the first time. Sophie continued speaking with the investor while softly correcting several translation errors from the presentation documents. She explained regional tax language, cultural preservation restrictions, and historical property distinctions with the ease of someone who had spent years inside elite European conversations. The assigned interpreter slowly lowered his headset, looking almost embarrassed. One of the executives whispered quietly, "How is that waitress speaking better French than the translator?" Nobody answered because nobody understood what they were witnessing. Nathaniel stepped closer slowly while Sophie finished translating another complex financial question involving Bordeaux hospitality investment regulations. The French investor suddenly smiled warmly for the first time all evening. "Finally," he said in English with a pleased laugh, "someone in New York who understands proper French business etiquette." Soft, nervous laughter spread through the ballroom, but Nathaniel noticed something else entirely. Sophie never once tried to impress anyone. She spoke the language the same way she carried wine trays. Calmly, precisely, without performance, which somehow made the moment even more unsettling. Nathaniel stopped only a few feet away from her now. "Where did you learn French like that?" Sophie adjusted the sleeve of her uniform quietly before answering. "My father believed pronunciation changes how seriously people listen to you." The sentence landed strangely hard inside the suddenly silent ballroom. The older French investor looked between them curiously. "Your father must have been an excellent teacher." Sophie gave a small polite nod. "He was." Nathaniel noticed the old French book partially visible inside the pocket of her serving apron. Worn edges. Notes handwritten along the margins. Not decorative. Used. The kind of book carried by someone who lived with language instead of studying it casually. "You studied in France?" Nathaniel asked carefully now. Sophie hesitated only briefly. "A long time ago." Before Nathaniel could ask another question, the older French investor spoke again in rapid formal French while pointing toward one of the projected investment clauses displayed on the ballroom screen. Sophie's eyes moved across the numbers instantly. Then something in her expression changed. Small, almost invisible, but Nathaniel noticed it immediately, because for the first time all evening, the calm waitress suddenly looked concerned. The concern in Sophie Lawrence's eyes lasted less than a second, but Nathaniel Crawford noticed it immediately. Years of billion-dollar negotiations trained him to detect hesitation the way other people notice changes in weather. Something about the French investor's question had unsettled her. The ballroom remained quiet beneath the soft jazz music while snow drifted against the towering windows surrounding the Windsor Palace Hotel. Wealthy executives still stood frozen near the projection screen, trying to process the fact that the quiet blonde waitress holding a silver tray spoke more elegant French than the hired interpreter. Sophie lowered her eyes toward the financial documents displayed beside the ballroom stage. "There is a problem with the regional tax allocation structure," she said softly in English. One of Nathaniel's senior advisors frowned immediately. "Impossible. Those documents came directly from Paris." Sophie remained calm. "That is exactly why the wording matters." The older French investor beside her slowly nodded with growing interest. "Continue, mademoiselle." Sophie glanced briefly toward Nathaniel before answering in fluent French again. Her voice moved smoothly through the ballroom, like soft music beneath the chandeliers. Elegant, precise, completely natural. She explained that one section of the investment structure used outdated provincial tax terminology no longer legally recognized after recent French commercial revisions. The difference sounded small to everyone else in the room. But according to Sophie, the error could shift millions of dollars in liability protections after the deal closed. Silence spread slowly across the ballroom. Nathaniel's legal advisor stepped toward the screen nervously while adjusting his glasses. "That cannot be right." Sophie looked at the projection calmly. The clause references pre-reform Bordeaux preservation exemptions. Those regulations changed 3 years ago. The older French investor smiled faintly beneath his silver beard. "She is correct." Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances immediately. Nathaniel noticed the shift spreading through the room now. Earlier, the guests laughed at Sophie for mispronouncing a wine label. Now nobody looked comfortable speaking around her at all. Nathaniel stepped closer toward the projection screen. "How would you even know that?" Sophie adjusted the silver tray against her arm quietly. "My father taught comparative French commercial law." Another silence followed, this one heavier. The assigned interpreter lowered his headset completely, now looking almost embarrassed to remain beside her. One of the younger investors laughed nervously beneath his breath. "A waitress teaching international tax corrections at a billion-dollar gala." Manhattan never disappoints. Sophie heard the comment, but showed no reaction. Nathaniel did. And strangely, for the first time that evening, the remark irritated him. The older French investor extended his hand politely towards Sophie. Henri Beaumont. Sophie shook it gently. Sophie Laurent. Henri studied her carefully now. You are not simply fluent. You were trained formally. Sophie gave a small, polite smile. A long time ago, Nathaniel noticed how carefully she answered every personal question. Never dishonest. Never fully open either. Like someone accustomed to protecting parts of her life from strangers. Henri turned back toward the projection screen while speaking rapid French again. Sophie translated instantly. He says if the legal structure remains unchanged, French regulators could freeze portions of the partnership after the first quarter review. Nathaniel's legal team immediately moved toward the contracts with growing panic beneath their polished composure. Quiet conversations spread through the ballroom while executives checked documents and whispered urgently into phones. The atmosphere of luxury celebration had shifted completely into controlled corporate anxiety. And standing calmly in the middle of it all was Sophie Laurent in a black waitress uniform, holding a silver tray beneath the ballroom lights. Nathaniel could not stop watching her now. Not because she impressed him, because something about her felt deeply out of place in a way he could not explain. The way she spoke, the way she carried herself. Even her silence felt educated, refined, like someone who once belonged inside rooms far more exclusive than this one. Sophie carefully placed the tray onto a nearby serving table while the executives continued reviewing the corrected contracts. Nathaniel stepped beside her quietly. You embarrassed my legal department tonight. Sophie looked slightly uncomfortable. That was not my intention. No, Nathaniel admitted softly. I do not think it was. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snow reflected softly through the windows beside them while jazz piano drifted quietly across the ballroom. Nathaniel noticed the old French novel partially visible inside her apron pocket again. Worn pages filled with handwritten notes. What book is that? He asked. Sophie glanced down instinctively before answering. Victor Hugo. Nathaniel almost smiled. Light reading for hotel shifts. Sophie finally looked at him directly. Her blue eyes remained calm despite the tension surrounding them. Some people scroll through phones during breaks. The answer caught him off guard slightly. Intelligent. Dry. Controlled. Before Nathaniel could respond, one of his executives approached looking pale. Nathaniel, we need to review every French compliance section immediately. Nathaniel nodded once, but kept his eyes on Sophie. Can she stay? The executive blinked in surprise. The waitress. Nathaniel's expression hardened subtly. The woman who just saved us from signing flawed contracts. Silence. The executive immediately corrected himself. Of course. Sophie looked genuinely uncomfortable now. I should probably get back to serving. No, Nathaniel said immediately. Softer this time. Please stay. The ballroom lights reflected warmly against the falling snow outside, while conversations continued growing more urgent around them. Several French investors now spoke quietly with Sophie in their native language while Nathaniel's executives watched with visible confusion and growing respect. Somewhere during the last 15 minutes, the invisible waitress had quietly become the most important person in the room. Henri Beaumont approached Nathaniel carefully while Sophie reviewed another translated document nearby. Where did you find her? Nathaniel answered honestly. I thought she was serving wine. Henri gave a knowing smile. No, his eyes moved towards Sophie thoughtfully. Women like that are rarely serving wine forever. Nathaniel followed his gaze across the ballroom. Sophie stood beneath the golden chandeliers calmly translating legal phrasing while executives twice her age listened carefully to every word she spoke. And for the first time all evening, Nathaniel Crawford realized something uncomfortable about himself. Earlier tonight, he corrected her pronunciation in front of everyone because he assumed she needed instruction. But now, watching the effortless elegance in the way she moved between languages and cultures, he understood the truth with growing embarrassment. Sophie Laurent had probably been speaking perfect French long before he ever learned how to pronounce the wine. The atmosphere inside the Windsor Palace ballroom changed completely after Sophie Laurent corrected the French investment documents. Earlier that evening, the room had treated her like part of the furniture. Invisible. Replaceable. Now executives who would normally never notice hotel staff lowered their voices when she walked past. Wealthy investors watched her carefully beneath the golden chandeliers, while soft jazz drifted through the room like smoke. Snow continued falling beyond the towering Manhattan windows, covering the city in white silence while tension quietly spread across the gala floor. Nathaniel Crawford stood near the projection screen reviewing revised legal documents with his advisors, but every few seconds his attention shifted back toward Sophie. She had returned to carrying wine glasses as though nothing extraordinary happened. Calm, quiet, controlled, which somehow unsettled him more than confidence would have. Most people became louder after impressing a room full of billionaires. Sophie seemed determined to disappear again. Henri Beaumont approached her beside the wine station, holding a crystal glass of Bordeaux. "Mademoiselle Laurent," he said warmly in French. "You studied in Paris, yes?" Sophie carefully poured wine into his glass before answering softly in the same language. "Only for a few years." Henri smiled knowingly. Not enough years to sound like that. Nathaniel watched the exchange from across the ballroom. Even without understanding every word, he recognized the rhythm of real fluency. Sophie did not translate French in her head first. She lived inside it naturally. One of Nathaniel's executives approached beside him quietly. "You should ask her to join the negotiation table." Nathaniel kept his eyes on Sophie. She works for the hotel and currently understands the investment structure better than our international consultants. Nathaniel could not argue with that. Near the ballroom windows, Sophie continued speaking with Henri while softly discussing Bordeaux property classifications and preservation laws from memory. Several French investors had slowly gathered around her now, listening with visible surprise. One older woman in diamonds suddenly laughed warmly. "You sound exactly like my professor at the Sorbonne." Sophie's expression softened faintly for the first time all evening. "My father studied there." Nathaniel noticed the subtle shift immediately. The moment her father entered the conversation, something behind Sophie's calm eyes became distant, guarded. Before anyone could ask another question, one of Nathaniel's legal advisors hurried across the ballroom, carrying a stack of corrected contracts. "Nathaniel, we found 3 additional translation inconsistencies." He lowered his voice carefully. "All of them favor the French holding group financially." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Intentional. We cannot prove it." Sophie overheard the final sentence while placing another wine bottle onto the serving station. She hesitated briefly before speaking quietly. French financial negotiations rarely rely on direct deception. Everyone nearby looked toward her instantly again. Sophie continued carefully. "They usually rely on elegant ambiguity." One of the executives frowned. "Meaning?" Sophie folded her hands calmly in front of her apron. "If wording remains technically legal but emotionally misleading, many investors consider it acceptable negotiation strategy." Henri Beaumont gave a soft, amused laugh. "She understands French business culture better than half the people in this room." Nathaniel stepped closer towards Sophie now. "Then tell me honestly." His voice lowered slightly. "Are they trying to manipulate the deal?" The ballroom became strangely quiet around them. Sophie looked toward the revised contracts before answering. "Not exactly." Nathaniel waited. Sophie's blue eyes lifted toward him carefully. "But several clauses assume you do not fully understand French regional financial etiquette." Nathaniel almost smiled despite the tension. "That sounds dangerously polite." Sophie gave the faintest nod. "French diplomacy usually is." Henri Beaumont suddenly looked thoughtful while studying Sophie more closely now. "Laurent," he repeated quietly. "Your father would not happen to be Daniel Laurent." Sophie became still. Very still. Nathaniel noticed immediately. The older French investor slowly lowered his wine glass. "The Geneva scholar?" Sophie answered softly after a long pause. "Yes." A visible reaction moved across several French guests nearby. Recognition. Surprise. One executive whispered quietly beneath his breath, "Wait. Daniel Laurent." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "I should know that name." Henri looked genuinely shocked. "Your generation probably forgot him." His eyes returned towards Sophie with growing disbelief. "But 20 years ago, Daniel Laurent advised multiple European diplomatic councils on international language negotiations." Nathaniel stared at Sophie. She lowered her eyes immediately. Henri continued softly now. "He was brilliant." One of the French investors nodded slowly. "I attended one of his lectures in Geneva." Another added quietly. "People traveled from 3 countries just to hear him speak." Nathaniel looked at Sophie differently now. The old French book, the precision, the elegance, the restraint. Suddenly, everything connected in ways that made the ballroom around him feel strangely superficial. Sophie adjusted the sleeve of her black uniform almost instinctively. My father retired a long time ago. Henry's expression shifted subtly. Sadness touched it briefly. That is not how people described what happened. Silence. Sophie looked away toward the snowy windows overlooking Manhattan. Nathaniel sensed the room stepping carefully around something painful now. Henri seemed to realize it too because his voice softened immediately. Forgive me. Sophie gave a small polite nod, but said nothing further. Nathaniel noticed how quickly she retreated emotionally anytime someone moved too close to her past, like someone protecting old fractures beneath polished composure. Before the silence could deepen further, two younger French investors near the balcony suddenly began speaking quietly in rapid French between themselves. Fast, casual, careless. They assumed nobody important nearby would fully understand. Sophie heard every word immediately, and the moment she did, her expression changed again. This time not concern, alarm. One of the men laughed softly while mentioning Nathaniel's name beside a phrase involving hidden restructuring penalties after acquisition. Sophie's fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray in her hands. Nathaniel saw it instantly. What did they say? Sophie hesitated. The jazz music continued drifting softly through the ballroom, while snow fell endlessly outside the windows. Wealthy guests kept laughing beneath golden chandeliers, completely unaware that the quiet waitress standing among them had just overheard something she was never supposed to understand. Sophie Laurent remained perfectly still beside the ballroom balcony after overhearing the quiet French conversation between the two younger investors. Around her, the Windsor Palace Hotel continued glowing beneath warm chandelier light, while jazz music drifted softly through the crowded ballroom. Crystal glasses reflected gold across marble floors. Snow covered Manhattan beyond the towering windows in slow, silent waves. To everyone else in the room, the evening still looked elegant, successful, sophisticated. But Sophie suddenly felt the same cold pressure she remembered from years ago, whenever powerful people spoke too comfortably in languages they assumed nobody else understood. Nathaniel Crawford noticed the change in her expression immediately. What did they say? He asked quietly. Sophie hesitated. The two French investors near the balcony continued sipping wine casually while discussing financial projections with other guests, completely unaware that the waitress standing 20 feet away understood every word they exchanged. Sophie lowered her voice carefully. They were discussing restructuring penalties hidden inside the acquisition clauses. Nathaniel frowned. We already reviewed those. Sophie looked directly at him now. Calm blue eyes. Controlled voice. Not the private versions. Silence settled heavily around them. Henri Beaumont slowly lowered his wine glass beside Nathaniel. Private versions? Sophie nodded slightly. One of them mentioned delayed liability transfers after asset integration. Nathaniel's expression hardened immediately. Meaning? Sophie answered softly. After the partnership finalizes, portions of your international properties could become financially responsible for losses generated through separate European holding companies. One of Nathaniel's executives stepped closer, looking confused. That is impossible. Sophie looked toward him politely. No, it is simply hidden beneath layered French commercial phrasing. Henri Beaumont's face darkened subtly. They buried debt exposure inside cultural investment protections. Sophie gave a small nod. Yes. The silence that followed felt colder than the snow outside. Nathaniel stared across the ballroom, toward the two investors laughing near the balcony. How much exposure? Sophie hesitated briefly before answering. Potentially hundreds of millions over several years. One executive quietly cursed beneath his breath. Another immediately opened contract files on his tablet with shaking hands. Nathaniel remained motionless for several seconds. Then slowly he turned back toward Sophie. You caught all that from one conversation. Sophie adjusted the silver tray against her arm. French investors speak indirectly when they believe nobody important understands them. Henri Beaumont gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Tonight they made a very expensive mistake. Across the ballroom, the two younger investors finally noticed the atmosphere shifting around Nathaniel's group. Their relaxed expressions faded almost immediately. Sophie saw the realization hit them both at once. Someone understood the conversation. Nathaniel noticed it too. They know, he said quietly. Sophie nodded once. Yes. The jazz pianist continued playing softly near the ballroom stage, while wealthy guests sensed tension moving through the gala like invisible smoke. Conversations lowered. Several executives stepped away to make urgent phone calls. Others reopened legal documents with growing panic hidden beneath polished professionalism. And standing silently in the center of all of it was Sophie Laurent in a black waitress uniform carrying a silver tray beneath crystal lights. Nathaniel looked at her differently now, not with curiosity anymore, with respect complicated by guilt. Earlier that evening he corrected her pronunciation publicly because he assumed she needed guidance. Now his entire billion-dollar partnership depended on her understanding of a language his legal team barely understood properly. Come with me, Nathaniel said quietly. Sophie blinked once. Where? Private conference room. Sophie immediately shook her head slightly. I am not part of these negotiations. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. You became part of them the moment you prevented my company from signing financial suicide. Henri Beaumont nodded in agreement. He is correct. Sophie looked uncomfortable beneath the sudden attention surrounding her. I work for the hotel. Nathaniel's voice softened unexpectedly. And tonight you are the smartest person in this ballroom. The sentence landed harder than he intended. Several nearby executives heard it too. No one argued. Sophie lowered her eyes briefly as though praise unsettled her more than criticism ever could. Nathaniel motioned toward the private hallway leading away from the ballroom. Please. After a long pause, Sophie finally nodded once. They moved through the quieter upper corridors of the Windsor Palace, while snow reflected silver light through massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Behind them, the ballroom remained alive with expensive conversations and nervous investors pretending the evening had not quietly shifted beneath their feet. Inside the private conference suite, dark walnut walls and soft amber lighting replaced the glittering atmosphere downstairs. Nathaniel closed the door carefully behind them, while several members of his legal team spread revised documents across the long conference table. Sophie remained standing near the entrance instinctively, still holding the silver tray like a shield between herself and the room. One of the attorneys immediately slid a contract toward her. Can you review Section 14? Sophie looked uncertain. I am not a lawyer. Henri Beaumont answered calmly from beside the fireplace. No. But apparently you understand French negotiation culture better than our lawyers. Sophie slowly placed the tray onto a nearby side table before approaching the contracts carefully. Nathaniel watched her closely now. The way she read, the way her eyes moved through paragraphs. Calm, focused, almost painfully familiar with complex language structures. This was not accidental fluency. This was years of training hidden beneath a waitress uniform. Sophie stopped suddenly halfway through one page. Her expression tightened almost invisibly. Nathaniel noticed immediately. What now? Sophie touched one sentence near the bottom of the page gently with her finger. This clause references a secondary holding group. One attorney frowned. That is standard. Sophie shook her head softly. No. The wording changes ownership responsibility after 12 months. Henri stepped closer quickly. Show me. Sophie translated the passage slowly into English while the room fell silent around her. With every sentence, the financial implications became worse. Hidden debt exposure, delayed liability transfers, international asset shielding. Nathaniel listened quietly while cold realization spread through his chest. The deal had never been designed as a partnership. It was a trap wrapped in elegant French language and luxury hospitality. One attorney finally whispered, Dear God. Sophie stepped back from the table immediately, as though she regretted speaking at all. I apologize. Nathaniel looked at her sharply. For what? Sophie lowered her eyes. People rarely enjoy hearing the truth once money is involved. The sentence lingered heavily through the conference room while snow continued falling outside the Manhattan windows. Nathaniel studied her silently then. The restraint, the intelligence, the sadness hidden beneath every careful answer. And for the first time that evening, he realized Sophie Laurent did not sound like someone discovering danger. She sounded like someone recognizing it from experience. The private conference suite overlooking Manhattan grew quieter with every page Sophie Laurent translated. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted across the city beneath silver midnight light, while inside the Windsor Palace Hotel, Several of New York's most powerful executives sat in complete silence listening to a waitress explain how they had nearly signed themselves into a financial disaster disguised as a luxury partnership. The room smelled faintly of espresso, old leather, and expensive cologne. But beneath all of it, tension had replaced the elegant atmosphere from downstairs. Nathaniel Crawford stood near the head of the conference table, watching Sophie carefully now. Not with curiosity anymore, with something deeper. Respect complicated by shame. Sophie remained beside the documents with one hand resting lightly against the polished walnut table. Her black waitress uniform looked strangely out of place beneath the warm amber lighting surrounded by executives in tailored suits and luxury watches. Yet somehow she carried herself more naturally in the room than half the people sitting there. One of the attorneys finally leaned back heavily in his chair after rereading the translated clauses. She is right, he admitted quietly. The restructuring liabilities transferred directly onto Crawford International after the first fiscal review. Another executive looked stunned. How did we miss this? Henri Beaumont answered calmly before Sophie could speak. Because French financial language is designed to sound elegant before it sounds dangerous. Sophie lowered her eyes slightly, especially when the other side assumes nobody will challenge the wording. Nathaniel slowly walked toward the windows overlooking snowy Manhattan while processing everything. His legal department had spent 6 weeks reviewing the partnership documents. International consultants charged hundreds of thousands of dollars to prepare the negotiations. Yet the person who uncovered the trap was the quiet blonde waitress carrying wine glasses through the ballroom. Nathaniel let out a slow breath beneath his nose. How much money would we have lost? One attorney answered carefully. Eventually, potentially close to $800 million in transferred liability exposure. Silence. Sophie remained still beside the table while several executives exchanged pale, uneasy glances. Nathaniel turned back toward her slowly. You saved my company tonight. Sophie shook her head gently. I translated what was already written. No, Nathaniel said quietly. You understood what everyone else ignored. The sentence settled heavily inside the room. Sophie looked uncomfortable hearing it aloud. Nathaniel noticed immediately. She reacted to praise almost the same way she reacted to personal questions. Carefully, defensively, like someone unaccustomed to trust. Henri Beaumont studied her thoughtfully from beside the fireplace. Your father taught you more than language. Sophie's expression softened faintly at the mention of him. He believed people reveal themselves most honestly when they think others do not understand them. One of the younger executives frowned. Daniel Laurent disappeared from public academia years ago, did he not? Sophie nodded once. After a financial scandal. The room became quieter again. Nathaniel noticed the subtle change in her voice whenever she mentioned her family. Controlled sadness hidden beneath polished composure. Henri looked genuinely regretful now. Many people believed your father was treated unfairly. Sophie gave a faint, tired smile. Many people believed many things. Before anyone could continue the conversation, one of Nathaniel's assistants entered quickly carrying updated financial reports. Mr. Crawford, the French delegation is asking why negotiations stopped. Nathaniel glanced towards Sophie briefly before answering. Tell them we are reviewing compliance structures. The assistant nodded before hesitating awkwardly. His eyes shifted towards Sophie, standing beside the conference table. Should I prepare credentials for Miss Laurent? The room fell silent for half a second. Earlier that evening, nobody in the hotel even looked directly at her. Now executives were asking whether she required formal negotiation access. Sophie noticed the irony too. Nathaniel answered calmly. Yes. The assistant immediately nodded and left. Sophie quietly looked toward the windows overlooking the snowy city. That is unnecessary. Nathaniel frowned slightly. No, it is overdue. The warmth in his voice surprised even him. Sophie glanced toward him briefly, but said nothing. Nathaniel moved back toward the conference table while legal teams continued revising documents around them. How did your father teach you all this? Sophie hesitated before answering. Dinner conversations mostly. One executive laughed softly in disbelief. Most families discuss sports at dinner. Sophie's expression almost softened into a real smile. My father preferred French diplomacy and economic philosophy. Henri Beaumont smiled warmly. That sounds exactly like Daniel Laurent. Sophie carefully picked up the old French novel from her apron pocket after it slipped slightly against the table edge. Nathaniel noticed the worn cover immediately. You carry that everywhere. Sophie looked down at the book quietly. It belonged to my father. Nathaniel stepped closer unintentionally. The margins were filled with handwritten notes in French and English. Elegant handwriting. Dense observations about language, history, and negotiation theory. Not academic vanity. Real thought. Real intelligence. You still study from it? Nathaniel asked softly. Sophie traced one finger lightly along the edge of the worn pages. Some people leave money for their children. She paused briefly. My father left language. The sentence settled over the room with unexpected emotional weight. Even the attorneys stopped typing for a moment. Nathaniel looked at Sophie differently then. Not as a mystery anymore, but as someone carrying pieces of another life hidden quietly beneath a waitress uniform, because the world stopped asking questions once it decided she was ordinary. Outside the windows, Manhattan glowed beneath falling snow, while downstairs the ballroom continued sparkling with music and expensive laughter. Yet up here, in the quiet conference room above the gala, a different kind of truth had finally surfaced. Intelligence did not always arrive wearing authority. Sometimes it carried silver trays and apologized politely while saving powerful men from their own arrogance. One of Nathaniel's senior advisors suddenly entered the room looking visibly unsettled. Nathaniel, he said carefully, there is another issue. Nathaniel turned immediately. What happened? The advisor lowered his voice. 2 members of the French delegation are requesting a private conversation downstairs. He hesitated briefly before continuing. And according to security, they specifically asked whether the waitress understands French as well as people are saying she does. The room became completely still. Sophie's fingers tightened slightly around her father's book. Nathaniel noticed it instantly. Why would they ask that? Sophie answered softly before anyone else could speak. Because they realized I heard something they never intended anyone in this building to understand. The conference suite above the Windsor Palace ballroom fell into complete silence after Sophie Laurent quietly admitted the French delegation realized she understood their private conversation. Outside the massive windows overlooking Manhattan, snow continued drifting across the city beneath pale, midnight light, while soft jazz music echoed faintly upward from the gala below. The contrast felt surreal. Wealthy guests downstairs still laughed beside crystal chandeliers and expensive wine, while upstairs several executives suddenly understood their billion-dollar partnership may have been built around deception from the beginning. Nathaniel Crawford watched Sophie carefully from across the conference table. Her calm expression remained composed, but he noticed the subtle tension in her hands as she held her father's worn French novel against her chest. Fear was not the right word. Recognition was. Like someone who had seen dangerous conversations hidden behind polite language before. One of Nathaniel's advisors finally broke the silence. What exactly did you hear downstairs? Sophie hesitated briefly before answering. They were discussing delayed restructuring penalties after asset integration. The advisor frowned. We already know that part. Sophie slowly looked toward him. No, her voice remained soft but precise. They were also discussing how quickly Crawford International would become dependent on the French holding group before the liabilities appeared publicly. Nathaniel's expression hardened immediately, meaning they planned this long-term. Sophie nodded once. Very long-term. Henri Beaumont looked genuinely disturbed now. That is not negotiation. Sophie lowered her eyes quietly. No, one attorney muttered softly beneath his breath. That is entrapment. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Central Park while processing everything. Snow covered the streets below in silver silence, while emergency traffic lights reflected faintly across the icy avenues. He had spent years building Crawford International into one of the most respected investment firms in New York. Tonight, he almost handed control of parts of his empire to people who assumed elegance could hide exploitation. And the only reason he discovered it was because a waitress carrying wine understood French better than his negotiation teams. Nathaniel turned back towards Sophie slowly. Why do I feel like this situation reminds you of something personal? The room grew quieter. Sophie looked down at the old novel in her hands before answering softly. Because my father warned people about financial diplomacy disguised as cultural partnership agreements years ago. Henri Beaumont stared at her immediately. Daniel Laurent investigated hidden restructuring systems before his scandal. Sophie gave a small, tired nod. Yes. Nathaniel frowned slightly. What scandal exactly? The room hesitated around the question. Sophie remained silent for several long seconds while snow brushed softly against the glass outside. Finally, Henri answered carefully. Officially, Daniel Laurent was accused of leaking confidential economic negotiations involving several European investment groups. Nathaniel studied Sophie's face closely. Officially, Sophie looked toward the floor. My father believed certain investors were intentionally burying financial control structures inside international partnership language. One executive laughed softly in disbelief. Exactly what happened tonight. Sophie nodded once. Yes. The realization settled heavily across the room. Nathaniel suddenly understood why Sophie reacted so strongly after overhearing the private French conversation downstairs. This was not simply business manipulation to her. It was history repeating itself. One of the attorneys quietly asked, "What happened to your father after the accusations?" Sophie's fingers tightened slightly around the book. Nobody invited him into rooms like this anymore. Silence followed. Nathaniel felt something uncomfortable move quietly through his chest then. Shame. Because only hours earlier, he publicly corrected Sophie's pronunciation in front of investors, while assuming she did not belong among them either. The irony felt almost painful now. A soft knock interrupted the room before one of Nathaniel's security advisors entered quickly. "Mr. Crawford." Nathaniel turned immediately. "What now?" The advisor looked uneasy. "Two members of the French delegation are preparing to leave the hotel early." Henri Beaumont frowned sharply. "Who?" The advisor mentioned the same two investors Sophie overheard near the ballroom balcony earlier. Nathaniel's jaw tightened instantly. "Stop them." Sophie immediately spoke. "No." Everyone looked toward her. Nathaniel frowned. "Why not?" Sophie answered calmly. "If you confront them directly, they will deny everything and shift blame toward translation misunderstandings." Henri nodded reluctantly. "She is right." Sophie stepped slowly toward the conference table where the contracts remained spread beneath warm amber light. French financial manipulation rarely survives public attention. Nathaniel studied her carefully. "What are you suggesting?" Sophie looked directly at him now. "Bring everyone back downstairs." One executive blinked in confusion. "For what?" Sophie answered softly. "Make them explain the contract language publicly." The room became completely still. Nathaniel slowly realized what she meant. If the hidden clauses were forced into open discussion before the full delegation and investors, the French group could no longer hide behind elegant ambiguity without exposing themselves in front of witnesses. Henri Beaumont almost smiled beneath his breath. "Your father taught strategy as well." Sophie gave a faint, sad smile. "My father taught survival." Nathaniel watched her quietly. Calm blue eyes beneath ballroom light. Black waitress uniform standing among million-dollar suits. Every powerful person in the room now listening carefully to every word she spoke. Earlier tonight, nobody even remembered her name. One executive finally shook his head in disbelief. This entire evening changed because a waitress understood French literature and financial law. Sophie lowered her eyes politely. Language reveals more than people realize. Nathaniel looked toward the conference room doors leading back down to the ballroom below. He could still hear distant jazz music drifting faintly upward through the hotel, while wealthy guests continued celebrating, unaware that the real power inside the building had shifted quietly away from the negotiation tables hours ago. Nathaniel turned back towards Sophie one final time before speaking. "Come downstairs with me." Sophie hesitated immediately. "Nathaniel." It was the first time she said his name without formality. He noticed. "No," he interrupted softly. "Tonight they need to hear the truth from the person who actually understands it." The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Not uncomfortable anymore. Certain. Because for the first time all evening, Sophie Laurent was no longer being treated like someone invisible standing near power. She had quietly become the person power itself needed most. The ballroom inside the Windsor Palace Hotel grew quieter the moment Nathaniel Crawford returned downstairs beside Sophie Laurent. Earlier that evening, guests barely noticed the blonde waitress carrying silver trays through the crowd. Now conversations lowered when she walked past beneath the chandeliers. Investors watched her carefully over crystal wine glasses while soft jazz floated through the room and snow drifted against the towering Manhattan windows beyond the marble balcony. Something invisible had changed inside the atmosphere of the gala. Power had shifted quietly away from the people holding contracts and toward the woman who understood what those contracts truly meant. Sophie remained calm beside Nathaniel as they crossed the ballroom floor together. Her black uniform still looked simple compared to the tailored tuxedos and designer gowns surrounding her, but somehow the contrast only made the room feel more uncomfortable now, because everyone understood the same thing at once. Intelligence did not care about status. Near the far side of the ballroom, the two younger French investors who had tried to leave early stiffened immediately when they saw Sophie returning beside Nathaniel. One of them quietly set down his wine glass. The other forced a diplomatic smile that never reached his eyes. Nathaniel stopped near the center of the ballroom beneath the grand chandelier, while executives and investors slowly gathered around him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "before tonight's negotiations continue, there are several financial translation issues requiring clarification." The room felt almost completely silent. Sophie felt dozens of eyes turning toward her immediately. Nathaniel noticed it too. Earlier they looked at her with dismissal. Now they looked at her with caution. Henri Beaumont stepped forward from the crowd beside Nathaniel. Certain clauses inside the proposed partnership documents appear to contain restructuring language not properly disclosed during negotiations. One of the younger French investors laughed softly. "Too quickly. Surely this is simply a misunderstanding." Sophie recognized the exact tone immediately. Elegant denial. Nathaniel glanced toward her once before speaking again. Miss Laurent translated the original phrasing personally. The investor's expression shifted almost invisibly. "The waitress." The sentence hung awkwardly inside the ballroom. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Sophie lowered her eyes briefly, but remained silent. Nathaniel's voice became colder. "The woman who prevented my company from accepting hidden liabilities." Silence. The investor straightened his jacket carefully while trying to recover composure. "Then perhaps Miss Laurent misunderstood nuanced commercial terminology." Sophie finally looked directly at him. Calm blue eyes beneath warm ballroom light. "No." Her voice remained soft, but perfectly clear. "I understood it exactly." The ballroom became still again. Even the jazz pianist near the stage seemed quieter somehow. Sophie continued carefully in flawless French now, her elegant pronunciation cutting cleanly through the room. She repeated the exact private phrases the investors used earlier near the balcony, discussing delayed financial transfer exposure after integration periods. Word for word. Several French guests immediately reacted with visible discomfort because the meaning sounded undeniable once spoken publicly. One executive quietly whispered, "Dear God." The younger investor's face lost color slightly. That conversation was private. Sophie answered gently in English. "You assume nobody nearby understood French." Henri Beaumont gave a low, humorless laugh beside his wine glass. "An expensive assumption." Nathaniel watched Sophie closely while she calmly explained the hidden restructuring clauses to the ballroom one section at a time. No anger, no dramatic performance, just quiet precision. The kind of intelligence that became impossible to argue with because it relied entirely on facts. Guests who ignored her hours earlier now listened to every word she spoke. One attorney from the French delegation suddenly interrupted sharply in French. Sophie answered immediately before the interpreter even moved. Elegant, controlled, faster than him. The room visibly shifted again after that. Nathaniel noticed several investors beginning to look embarrassed now, not because of the contracts, because they remembered how they treated her earlier. Sophie stepped toward the projection screen displaying the revised financial agreements. "This clause," she explained calmly while pointing toward one paragraph, "creates delayed ownership liability through secondary holding structures after 12 months. Several executives nodded quietly while reviewing updated translations on their tablets. Sophie continued, "And this language here allows financial losses from separate regional investments to transfer gradually onto Crawford International assets." One of the younger French investors finally snapped slightly beneath the pressure. "This is standard European negotiation strategy." Sophie looked toward him softly. No silence. Her voice remained calm. "It is manipulation hidden beneath polite language." The sentence landed heavily through the ballroom. Nathaniel almost smiled despite the tension because nobody in the room sounded more composed than the waitress they dismissed at the beginning of the evening. Henri Beaumont slowly lifted his wine glass towards Sophie with visible admiration. "Your father would be proud tonight." Sophie became very still for half a second after hearing the words. Nathaniel noticed immediately. One of the older French guests looked toward her carefully. Daniel Laurent's daughter was working here this entire time. Quiet recognition spread through portions of the ballroom now. Some guests remembered the name immediately. Geneva diplomacy, international language theory, financial negotiation ethics. Nathaniel watched the realization move across the room in waves. Sophie Laurent had not suddenly become intelligent tonight. The room had simply discovered who she already was. One executive near the back muttered quietly, "We treated her like hotel staff." Nathaniel heard him. So did Sophie. But she showed no reaction. Nathaniel suddenly understood something painful then. People always respected expertise more once it arrived connected to famous names and powerful titles. Earlier Sophie spoke the same way, understood the same language, possessed the same intelligence. But nobody cared until wealthy men confirmed her value publicly. The ballroom doors near the entrance slowly closed as snow continued falling outside over Manhattan. Nathaniel stepped beside Sophie near the projection screen, while every investor in the room watched them carefully now. He looked toward the French delegation calmly. "Crawford International is suspending all negotiations pending complete legal review." No one argued. They could not. Sophie's translations had exposed too much already. The younger investors quietly lowered their eyes while executives whispered urgently around the ballroom. Nathaniel glanced toward Sophie, once more beneath the golden chandelier light. Earlier tonight, he corrected her pronunciation publicly because he believed she did not belong in rooms like this. Now the entire room stood silent because she understood it better than everyone else inside. The ballroom remained unusually quiet after Nathaniel Crawford publicly suspended the negotiations. Earlier that evening, the Windsor Palace Hotel had glowed with effortless luxury beneath crystal chandeliers and soft jazz music. Now tension moved silently through the crowd like cold air beneath a closed door. French investors whispered carefully among themselves while executives checked revised financial documents with visible anxiety. Snow continued falling beyond the massive windows overlooking Manhattan, covering the city in silver light, while inside the ballroom the emotional balance of the evening had shifted completely. Sophie Laurent stood near the projection screen with her father's old French novel resting quietly against her side. She looked calm beneath the golden ballroom lighting, but Nathaniel noticed the exhaustion beginning to settle behind her blue eyes now. Hours of tension had finally started reaching her. One of the hotel managers approached nervously from across the ballroom. "Miss Laurent," he said carefully, "the evening staff needs you back downstairs." Several executives immediately looked uncomfortable hearing the sentence. Sophie simply nodded politely. "Of course." Nathaniel spoke before she could move. "No," the manager froze. Nathaniel's voice remained controlled but firm. "Miss Laurent is assisting Crawford International." The manager blinked awkwardly. "She is still scheduled for service responsibilities." Nathaniel reached into his tuxedo pocket and removed a black corporate card without even looking away from Sophie. "Then Crawford International will compensate the hotel for the entire ballroom staff tonight." Silence. Even nearby investors stopped speaking. The manager quickly nodded. "Understood, Mr. Crawford." Sophie looked genuinely surprised for the first time all evening. Nathaniel noticed immediately. "You should not be carrying trays after what just happened here," he said quietly. Sophie lowered her eyes slightly. "I have carried them before." The sentence sounded simple, but something sad moved quietly beneath it. Nathaniel understood what she truly meant. She had spent years being underestimated because people stopped looking beyond the uniform. Henri Beaumont approached beside them holding a glass of Bordeaux. "The younger delegation members are leaving," he said softly in French. Sophie glanced toward the ballroom entrance where the two investors quietly gathered their coats near the marble staircase. Their earlier confidence had disappeared completely. Nathaniel noticed one of them avoiding eye contact with Sophie now. "Good," Nathaniel answered coldly. Henri looked towards Sophie thoughtfully. "You realize many people in this room will remember your name after tonight." Sophie's expression became distant again. "That has not always been a good thing for my family." Henry's face softened immediately. "No," he admitted quietly. "Perhaps not." The jazz pianist near the ballroom stage slowly transitioned into a softer melody while guests resumed quieter conversations around the edges of the room. But nobody treated Sophie the same way anymore. Investors greeted her respectfully as she passed. Executives stepped aside instinctively to let her move through the crowd. Even the hotel staff looked at her differently now. Not because she changed, because everyone else finally understood who she had been all along. Nathaniel walked beside her toward the quieter hallway overlooking the snow-covered city outside. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt strangely comfortable now compared to earlier tension. Sophie stopped near one of the massive windows facing Central Park, where white snow drifted endlessly beneath the Manhattan skyline. "It is beautiful tonight," she said softly. Nathaniel looked toward the city lights reflecting across the glass. "You still sound French sometimes when you say certain words." Sophie smiled faintly. "My father hated American pronunciation." Nathaniel almost laughed quietly beneath his breath. "I noticed." Sophie looked down briefly at the old novel in her hands. He believed language carried dignity. Nathaniel studied her carefully. "And do you believe that too?" Sophie remained silent for several seconds before answering. "I think people listen differently depending on who is speaking." The sentence settled heavily between them because Nathaniel knew exactly what she meant. Earlier tonight, she spoke the same perfect French with the same intelligence, but nobody respected it until wealthy men publicly validated her value. Nathaniel leaned lightly against the marble window frame beside her. "For what it is worth," he hesitated briefly. "I was embarrassed about earlier." Sophie looked toward him quietly. "The wine pronunciation." Nathaniel nodded once. "I assumed you needed correction." Sophie's expression remained calm. "Most people assume many things about waitresses." Nathaniel let out a slow breath. "That does not excuse it." Sophie studied the falling snow outside before answering softly. No, the honesty of the reply somehow made Nathaniel respect her even more. She never softened truth simply to make powerful people comfortable. A few feet away, ballroom guests continued moving beneath golden chandeliers, while soft music echoed through the luxury hotel. Yet near the snowy windows overlooking Manhattan, the atmosphere between Nathaniel and Sophie felt quieter than the rest of the building. More real somehow. Nathaniel glanced toward the worn French novel again. "What was your father like?" Sophie's fingers rested lightly against the book cover. "Brilliant." A small sad smile touched her face briefly. "And terrible at pretending powerful people were always right." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "I think I would have liked him." Sophie looked toward the city lights again. "Most people liked him before they realized he could hear what they were hiding." The sentence lingered softly in the air between them. Nathaniel suddenly understood something important then. Sophie's intelligence was not only inherited. It was trained through years of watching her father challenge rooms filled with influential people who preferred comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth. A hotel employee passed quietly through the hallway carrying empty champagne glasses while distant laughter echoed from the ballroom behind them. Sophie finally turned slightly toward Nathaniel. "You know what the strange part is?" "What?" Nathaniel asked softly. Sophie gave the faintest smile beneath the reflection of falling snow against the glass. "Earlier tonight, nobody noticed me until I spoke French." Nathaniel looked at her carefully now. Sophie's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "But I was exactly the same person before I opened my mouth." The truth inside the sentence settled over him harder than anything else she had said all evening. Because deep down Nathaniel realized the real humiliation tonight did not belong to Sophie Laurent. It belonged to every powerful person in the ballroom who needed a language they respected before they could recognize the intelligence standing directly in front of them. The gala inside the Windsor Palace Hotel slowly began dissolving into smaller, quieter conversations after Nathaniel Crawford suspended the negotiations publicly. Wealthy investors drifted toward the ballroom exits beneath golden chandeliers, while jazz music softened into a slower melody near the stage. Crystal glasses stood half-empty across marble tables. Snow continued falling beyond the towering windows overlooking Manhattan, covering the city in pale silver light, while luxury cars waited outside beneath the storm. But near the far end of the ballroom, beside the massive windows facing Central Park, Sophie Laurent remained standing quietly alone. Her black waitress uniform still looked unchanged from earlier that evening. The same silver buttons, the same press sleeves, the same old French novel resting gently against her side. Yet somehow the entire room now looked at her differently. Hotel staff passed by offering small respectful nods. Investors lowered their voices when speaking near her. Executives who ignored her hours earlier now watched her with visible curiosity and unease. Sophie noticed all of it, and somehow that made her sadder than being invisible ever did. Nathaniel Crawford stood several feet away near the ballroom entrance, speaking quietly with legal advisors while guests slowly departed through the marble corridors. Every few moments his attention drifted back towards Sophie beside the windows. She looked calm beneath the chandelier light, but there was loneliness in the stillness around her now. The kind carried by people who spent years being misunderstood long before one dramatic evening changed how the world saw them. Henri Beaumont approached Sophie softly with his coat folded over one arm. Your father once embarrassed an entire diplomatic council in Geneva using only grammar corrections, he said warmly in French. Sophie smiled faintly for the first time in nearly an hour. That sounds like him. Henry's eyes softened. Tonight reminded me of those years. Sophie looked down briefly at the old novel in her hands. Most people stopped talking about him after the scandal. Henri shook his head slowly. No. Most people stopped saying his name publicly. The sentence lingered quietly between them while snow brushed against the towering windows nearby. Nathaniel watched the exchange from across the ballroom before finally walking toward them. Henri nodded politely toward him. Mr. Crawford. Nathaniel extended his hand respectfully. Thank you for staying tonight. Henri smiled slightly. I stayed because intelligent people should not stand alone in rooms like this. Sophie lowered her eyes at the comment, while Henri slowly stepped away toward the ballroom exit, leaving Nathaniel and Sophie alone beside the snowy Manhattan windows. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The ballroom had become much quieter now. Staff members collected glasses beneath dimmed chandeliers, while the jazz pianist packed away sheet music near the stage. Earlier, the room felt filled with performance and status. Now it simply felt human. Nathaniel stood beside Sophie near the glass overlooking Central Park, where snow covered the dark trees below in white silence. You were right earlier, he said softly. Sophie glanced toward him. About what? Nathaniel looked out toward the city lights. People listened only after someone powerful confirmed your intelligence. Sophie gave a faint, tired smile. That happens more often than people admit. Nathaniel nodded slowly because he knew she was right. Earlier tonight, she spoke the same perfect French, understood the same financial structures, carried the same quiet intelligence. But nobody respected it until wealthy executives repeated her words back to the room. Nathaniel looked toward the old novel in her hands again. May I? Sophie hesitated briefly before handing him the book carefully. Nathaniel opened the worn pages gently beneath the warm ballroom lights. French notes filled the margins in elegant handwriting beside underlined passages about diplomacy, language, and truth. Near the center of the book, one handwritten sentence stopped him completely. Language reveals character faster than power ever will. Nathaniel looked up slowly. Your father wrote this? Sophie nodded once. During my first year in Paris. Nathaniel closed the book carefully before returning it to her. He sounds like a remarkable man. Sophie's expression softened with quiet sadness. He was difficult. Nathaniel almost smiled. Those are usually the people who change rooms after they leave them. Sophie looked toward the snowy skyline outside, while the ballroom lights reflected softly across the glass around them. My father used to say the world only respects intelligence once it becomes expensive. Nathaniel studied her carefully. And do you believe that? Sophie thought for several seconds before answering. I think people confuse appearance with worth because it is easier than paying attention. Silence settled gently between them. Not awkward anymore. Honest. Somewhere behind them, hotel staff lowered the ballroom lights one level dimmer, while soft piano music echoed quietly through the nearly empty hall. Nathaniel glanced toward Sophie again. What happens now? Sophie smiled faintly beneath the reflection of falling snow. For the negotiations? Nathaniel shook his head slightly. For you. Sophie looked genuinely surprised by the question. Then she glanced down at her waitress uniform almost thoughtfully. Tomorrow morning, I probably serve coffee at 7:30 like usual. Nathaniel let out a quiet laugh beneath his breath. After tonight? Sophie finally looked directly at him again. Calm blue eyes beneath golden chandelier light. I was the same person yesterday. The simplicity of the answer settled deeply inside him. Nathaniel realized then that Sophie Laurent never changed during the evening. The only thing that changed was the room finally learning how to see her clearly. Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and removed a small silver business card holder. He handed her one card quietly. If you ever decide you are tired of carrying trays through hotel ballrooms. Sophie glanced down at the card, but did not take it immediately. Nathaniel continued softly. Crawford International could use someone who understands people as well as language. Sophie studied him for a long moment before carefully accepting the card between her fingers. Outside the Windsor Palace Hotel, Manhattan disappeared deeper into snowfall while luxury cars pulled away one by one into the glowing city streets. Inside the nearly empty ballroom, Nathaniel Crawford stood beside the quiet waitress he once corrected publicly over wine pronunciation. And somewhere between the chandeliers, the French contracts, the snowfall, and the silence afterward, he finally understood something that would stay with him far longer than any business negotiation ever could. The most extraordinary people rarely announce themselves when they enter a room. Most of the time, they stand quietly in the corner while everyone else decides whether someone without status deserves to be heard at all.